Naomi, I was hoping you would start with a word of prayer. But so be it. Before I start, please forgive my voice if it sounds a little bit nasal or raspy. My recent trips have taken a toll. So I'm a little bit congested. I may have to depart the stage ever so often to decently clear my throat. So please forgive me of that. I want to discuss several matters this morning. First being Petrojam, but I would also want to, while I'm doing so, have the attention of the press to give an update on my recent trips overseas to Washington, to G20, and to CARICOM, as I believe those are also matters for which the nation should be updated. I want to start, however, with Petrojam. First, let me again restate for the records our commendations for the Auditor General for the report that she prepared and delivered. It is of a standard that the nation can be proud of. I have requested a meeting with the Auditor General to further discuss some of her recommendations. These are not necessarily recommendations specific to Petrojam, but recommendations which could be system-wide. She has indicated such, and we have seen as well, where there could be tweaks as well as profound changes to the structure of governance in our country that could improve efficiency of public administration. So I will be meeting with the Auditor General when we're finished here. Yesterday, we had a discussion at our Central Executive of the Jamaica Labour Party, and it was unanimously agreed that every effort should be made to have the Auditor General's report examined by the relevant bodies of Parliament, the relevant committees of Parliament. And so the Leader of Government Business will caucus with the government members of the committee, the PAC, to ensure that at the earliest possible practical time that the report is brought for the scrutiny and supervision. And I'll have some more to say on that later. I want to start as well by acknowledging what was said in the papers on Sunday by former Minister Wheatley regarding his own acceptance of the report. I thought that it is important that, as a former minister, that he embraces the report. It is also important that he accepts that there were areas in the report which clearly indicated where there was not the expected standard of discharge of public duties, both from oversight, governance, and specifically as it relates to the use of public funds. And I want to start there because that is an important principle that the government must not just speak about in words, but in practice and reinforce it. In the past, when issues such as these have been brought to public attention, reports have been tabled, but we have seldom sought to make restitution. Coming out of this exercise, Jamaica can only benefit. Our system of governance can only grow stronger if we establish that there has to be a principle of restitution. If public agents cause funds to be used inappropriately, illegally, then those who benefited and those who caused the government to lose must make restitution. So I'm happy to see that Minister Wheatley has embraced that principle and has said that he will seek to ensure that the public purse is restored. I think that principle should go to the fullest in that regard. And where it is clear by virtue of the report that there was a case of the misuse of public funds, then I'm going to direct the board to take such civil actions as are necessary to recover those funds. I want the public to bear in mind, however, that the report of the Auditor General is only one report. It is only one process of accountability. There is still ongoing, an ongoing investigation into Petrojam by the Integrity Commission and MOCA. I can't tell you the details of it, but let me rephrase that. I don't know the details of it. In fact, let me rephrase that. I don't know anything about the investigation other than there is an investigation. I'm of the view that they would be focusing on matters that are criminal in nature. But I'm saying over and above that, that where the board sees that, for example, payments were made for work on a contract, and by virtue of delays and changes, the contract is terminated, but full payment was made and work not completed. The board should seek legal advice and prepare to recover such funds through civil means. That is a directive given to the board. That is part of the principle of restitution that will ensure that there is accountability. The report focused heavily on lack of oversight. And I had to reflect deeply on these issues because there are many factors that lead to lack of oversight. Some of them are mitigating, and others of them should be dismissed, actually. We start off with a principle that is important to governance, and that is ministerial responsibility. The assumption is that the minister should know. That is the headline assumption. It is not an absolute assumption. There have been cases, legal cases, which shows where there are exceptions to the fact. If somebody conspires to keep something from you, obviously, you would know. But generally, and by our constitution, the ministers and the cabinet is charged with the appropriate policy direction and control of administration. It's a heavy job, therefore, being a minister. It's not about just having a title. It involves actual work, actual reading of the documents, actually meeting with your minister, your appointees and persons who work under your charge. So, in the execution of that headline of "you should know," then that means, as minister, you should interrogate. For your own safety and protection, you should ask questions. You should seek to know. It is therefore not only a reliance on what you are told by your permanent secretary, but in the higher exercise of that duty of responsibility, duty and responsibility, you have to actually inquire. Now, sometimes that process of inquiry and interrogation could be called meddling. And it is a fine line sometimes between inquiring and investigating and meddling. But once it is only for knowledge, then you cannot be in any way accused of meddling. Meddling only comes when there is an attempt to use your authority to influence a decision when there is already established a process which removes discretion. So, in my mind, no public servant should be in any way, unless prescribed by law, not provide a minister with information when it is requested. So the duty of the minister is to ask, and I am certain that the duty of the public servant, the civil servant, the public sector worker is to provide the information. It is clear from the Auditor General's report that there was a breakdown in this regard. That minutes were not provided and they were not requested. From the permanent secretary's point of view, the permanent secretary has oversight responsibility for the ministry and all its agencies. But the permanent secretary does not give policy direction. The permanent secretary cannot usurp or subvert the statutory, well, the laws actually, that are set up to govern and guide statutory bodies, executive agencies, and other public sector bodies. They have their own scheme of management and their own system of accountability. But the permanent secretary should keep a reconnaissance of what they are doing and advise the minister as well. In this case, it is clear that the conclusion of the Auditor General is that that also broke down. So the question is, what more can government do to ensure that we don't have any such gaps in the future? Because I wouldn't want the public to believe that there are no rules to govern this or nothing was done. It is, in essence, a lapse of the execution of the framework for governance and what is already in the PBMA. You would have heard Permanent Secretary Audrey Sewell make her impassioned plea to the, I believe it was a public accounts, the PAAC, right? Yeah, the committee regarding the expectations placed on the permanent secretary, but yet not having the authority to address it. It's a delicate balance. You know, I can't at this podium say that we're going to give no authority to the permanent secretary because the permanent secretaries are already stretched with what they have to do. So I'm interested in hearing from the Auditor General, which is why I'm meeting with her at 12:30, to get from her a sense of what would be some of the other recommendations that could be made to strengthen that. In the interim, however, I can make decisions about ministers. And so I have made a decision to make it mandatory that all ministers must have a quarterly meeting with their board chairman with the specific task of reviewing the minutes and activities of the board for that quarter and to plan for the quarter coming. It is a mandate now, and I'm going to ask the Cabinet Office to put that in the code of conduct for ministers. I'm also mandating that ministers meet with their board chairman and the board, full board where possible, biannually, to have a policy review. So the quarterly meeting is more to enshrine the process of interrogation, of administration. And the biannual meeting is to ensure that the boards are focused on policy. So this is a mechanism for evaluation. Now, some ministers do this, but it is not a standard procedure across how ministers function. But going forward, all ministers will have to function in this regard. So then, there is no possibility of a minister saying, I did not know. It is going to mean more work, but we have to become smarter in how we do our work, employ technology, restructure business process, re-engineering of our business processes to ensure that we maximize our time. The public is demanding this, but the public should also understand that as we tighten and intensify accountability, it also leads to another question within the face of limited resources. And this is one thing that has been hinted all over the report. Are our public agencies properly missioned? You see, when a public agency starts to feel that it is appropriate to have personal expenses tagged on to the public funds, then you start to wonder what is happening to the mission. What is happening to the mission? So, from an administrative point of view, in my role as Prime Minister, I'm going to ask all my ministers to reflect on the mission of all their agencies and to ensure that there is a recommitment of all the boards to the mission set. And all of those boards should have their mission statements, they should have their policies set out, and the ministers have to go through that exercise with each and every board. Because it is not just, people not following the procedures. Sometimes it is a mindset that has set into the administration. And at all costs, we have to combat that kind of mindset in the administration. One of the things that Jamaicans are perturbed about is this issue of oil losses. Almost 600,000 barrels, am I right, of losses. I met with the board of Petrojam on Friday. We spent 3 hours discussing the report, 2 of which was on oil losses. I have come to the conclusion, based upon the meeting and what is in the report, that there needs to be a forensic audit into these losses. And so I'm going to direct the board to once again, and I say once again, I have never done it before, but there have been several audits, including forensic audits, done. But I'm going to once again, this time for the last time, direct the board to start the process to identify how can we lose 600,000 barrels of oil over 5 years, and to explain to the public what this is, because some people have said it's stolen oil, it's missing oil. As I dig deeper, there could be the possibility of pilferage, and indeed, we have heard anecdotal cases of pilferage of finished products. But it could be wastage. It could be technical losses. We need to know exactly what are the proportions, what causes it. That leads me, well, before I go into the point that leads on directly from that, the other area that is of great concern to the public is the pricing mechanism. Minister Shaw has always been advocating for a more open, transparent process, and has questioned in Parliament on several occasions the pricing mechanism of Petrojam. The opposition has asked me questions about the pricing mechanism of Petrojam. And in preparing to respond, which I did submit those answers, I got some knowledge. I'm not an expert in the area, so I can't own the information that is given. But the response has traditionally been that it is the best pricing mechanism. Obviously, the public has another view. Because, and it's for a simple reason, sometimes you hear world oil prices are going down, but yet when you go to the pump, your prices tend to be going up. And sometimes this happens. There is some process of discretion used in determining the price, but there is a calculation, I would put it, a formula that has been reviewed and is said to be a good formula for determining the price. But there is an adjustment made to the formula, and that adjustment is really an exercise of discretion. And it is in that exercise of discretion that I think we have the opportunity to bring transparency. The minutes of the committee that deals with the pricing on a weekly basis is not minuted. I am directing the board that as of now, there must be minutes of the meeting, and those minutes must be sent to the ministry and to the Ministry of Finance, the Enterprise Division, or directly to the Minister of Finance, so that there can be some review. I'm also going to recommend, after further consultation with the board, how we can introduce independent parties into that process. It's a tricky area because you don't want people to come in and then take out information. So who we select, you would have to be careful that they don't have any special interest and that they are vetted. So two things. One is to ensure that the minutes of the meeting are taken and sent to independent oversight bodies, and to include other persons. I'm thinking, for example, the Consumer Affairs Commission, a representative from the Ministry of Finance. But I will give further details as to how that can be done. And that will help to bring some level of clarity to it. I want to then move on to the other element of the report, which deals with the inefficiency in operations. Petrojam celebrated its 35th year, I believe, last year. The plant is old. Forgive me, 35 years old. Not old, but in plant life. The equipment, many of them have reached their useful life. And to go back to what I was saying earlier regarding doing the investigation to find out why we're having the losses, in meeting with the board disclosed that their largest tank had a significant leak. And that is just as by virtue of the passage of time and the chemical reaction with the crude. The linings have deteriorated over time. The tanks have deteriorated. So there are leaks in the tank. These are not simple tanks. It's $10 million to to repair them, and they have started that process. I'll ask the general manager to give an update as to where we are with the repair of the tanks. But generally, the plant is old, so it is not operating at its true level of efficiency. Having said that, in 2006, the government of Jamaica decided to divest 49% of the ownership of Petrojam to PDVSA, that is the Venezuelan oil company, state-owned oil company. Part of the reason for that divestment was not just to get an injection of cash flow immediately, but to get a partner who could assist in the upgrade of the refinery. Now, I'm saying this is from 2006. Back then, the upgrade would have costed somewhere in the region of $1 billion US. That would be phase one of the upgrade. We have not had the upgrade refinery since 2006. I don't want this statement to be interpreted as me blaming the Venezuelan government, because both parties are to be blamed. In a sense, at one point in time, we simply were not in a position to carry out a refinery upgrade in 2009 to 2011, thereabouts, up to 2013, when we had that massive fiscal downturn. We wouldn't have been able to come up with the funds to do that. But there is another element which we must consider. Since then, Venezuela has also had its own difficulties, which would have prevented them from fulfilling their end of the bargain. So, the renewal of our refinery has been delayed for over a decade. And it is likely that if the current situation remains, the refinery could end up being obsolete. In fact, it is near obsolescence now. And so what we see here as oil losses will continue to rise. The impact of that, of course, is on the profitability of the entity. But within the last 3 years, sanctions have been placed on Venezuela. And the sanctions have become progressively difficult, to the point where businesses or countries that do business with Venezuelan government or businesses could themselves be sanctioned. Indeed, that is the situation now. That is the nature of the sanctions that are in place now. We have only managed to survive because we have pled our case, and there is the exercise of some discretion. But we should not rest comfortably in this situation. Recent events have shown that when the sanctions are executed, that they can have consequences. And so Jamaica is in an invidious position. It is becoming increasingly difficult for us to pay for the oil that we purchase, the finished products that we purchase, because it has to go through banks which are very careful in observing the sanctions. So it's one thing for the government of the United States to say, all right, you can go. But it's another thing for a bank that has to take into consideration other factors to say, all right, I will process your transactions. And you begin to understand this when you look at this, the sanctions and the fines that have been levied on banks globally for breaching the sanctions. So we're in a very tenuous situation as it is now. So when you put all that together, and then you reflect on the market conditions, as have been outlined in the Auditor General's report, which states that come next year, a large part of Petrojam's customer base, or custom rather, will disappear. As the country converts to LNG, we are no longer using crude to produce heavy fuel oils. And so potentially 70% of Petrojam's output, which is normally utilized to produce energy, could go potentially. So what would happen then? The government has declared officially 30% of its electricity generation should be from renewables. I am saying it should be 50 or more. For our economic independence, we need to have renewables as the critical part of our electricity generation. And more it is evolving to that possibility that we could have more and more renewables replacing fossil fuels. What will happen to Petrojam then? You may say, well, you'll always have cars. I want to signal to Jamaicans that the technology is rapidly evolving towards electric vehicles. So within the next decade, you are likely to see electric vehicles becoming more accessible. And I'm signaling now that the government is more inclined towards supporting the use of electric vehicles locally. So I'm saying all of this to say that the dynamics that existed in 1982, I believe it would have been, when the government decided to own Petrojam for strategic reasons, for energy security, when the geopolitics was different, that those dynamics no longer exist. It's a totally different dynamic now. So the strategic reason for owning the asset no longer exists. That's changed. If things continue on their current path, Petrojam could become a fiscal risk to the government. Meaning that if they lose market share and we don't do the refinery upgrade for them to diversify into other products, they could make huge losses, which will then fall to who? You, the taxpayers. So I can't sit here, and yes, I mean, I have to pay attention to these other issues which have arisen, but I also have to be looking in the long term. I want Jamaicans to recall that we ended up in a debt crisis, not just because of FinSac, but because we were not looking at state entities that were racking up significant losses. And it is only when they became a fiscal risk that we were in reaction mode trying to divest. I'm saying before we reach to that, having learned from that experience, we have to be thinking strategically. Which is why I have put together the Petrojam Review Commission. And they are tasked with doing that high-level strategic review, to interview people in the industry, to interview and have discussions with our partners and businesses that work along with Petrojam so we can come up with the right position for Petrojam. In all of this, the workers of Petrojam are listening. I toured the plant earlier this year. Wonderful set of people, obviously very committed, but very nervous and battered because on the street people are saying they're all corrupt. And that is not true. We don't want our Jamaicans having to hide to wear their workplace shirt and emblem. That's not what we want. And I'm hoping that the public will be more sensitive in how they address the issue, because not everyone who works in the organization is responsible. So we're considerate about them. And we want to be making decisions that will be least negatively impactful on the workers. And that's why you have to start planning from now. We have to start that planning from now. The challenge we face in moving forward the plan is that we have offered to buy back the 49% shares from our friends in Venezuela. Venezuela has always been very good to us. Whether it is the San Andreas Accord or Petrocaribe. The people of Venezuela have always reached out to Jamaica. The basis of that, of course, is that their own liberator and founder, Simon Bolivar, spent some useful time here. So there is a very strong bond between Jamaica and Venezuela. But as it is now, with this transaction between Jamaica and Venezuela, Petrojam in its present state, with the present market conditions, the presence of sanctions, the present geopolitical issues, Petrojam is at risk. And we would want to see a speedy resolution with the government of Venezuela. We would want to close the proposed buyback of the shares. I'm going to ask Minister Johnson-Smith later on, if you choose to ask her questions, to give you an update as to what we have been doing for the last 2 years to secure the buyback so that we can move forward with the refinery to protect the workers' interests and to protect our national interests. Ladies and gentlemen, the last thing I would want to point out is that earlier in the year, the government announced that it would pursue a VDU, the vacuum distillation unit, which would allow it to enter into a diversified product base to produce asphalt as a main component of its output. The government has to consider carefully the expenditure of $100 million US. As at this point, for us to make that expenditure, we have to look carefully at the overall position of Petrojam. So we have decided to return the $100 million to the Minister of Finance. He will, Minister, there is no distinction. I'm returning it, you know what, let me not say it. Let me return it to the Ministry of Finance, unless somebody see you on the road and ask you for it. So that money that was allocated to do the VDU, we are returning it. It's a proper cash management exercise. It doesn't make sense to have the money sitting down not using when the government has hundreds of other things that it could use it on to increase the revenue base of the government. So we have decided as well to do that. I believe I've generally covered the various areas of the report. If there are areas that I have not covered or you would want more details on, I will break now, give my voice a rest, and take questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And now, ladies and gentlemen of the media, you may be able to ask questions. As is our custom here, we ask you to raise your hand. Once you are identified, we'll supply you with a microphone. We ask you to identify yourself, your media entity, and ask your questions. Today, though, given that we have several media entities, I'm hoping that you would allow your colleagues to ask their questions too, if you have questions back to back. But we'll allow a free-flowing, of course. I'm not seeing any hands yet. All right. Oh, this side. All right. Let's go to Prince and then Tona.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Prince Moore, RJR.
Oh, good.
There has been calls for persons who received contracts in breach of the rules to be identified and blacklisted. Is this something that the government would be considering?
There are two issues. When I was reading the Auditor General report, I wondered why she was so very careful not to name anyone. And I decided I would take my cue from her until I have cleared it with the Auditor General. You see the two AGs, with the Attorney General, to make sure that there are no legal implications and that I wouldn't be breaching anybody's rights or any rules. So my view is that they should be named. I just want to be sure that I'm on a solid legal footing, and I'll discuss that when I meet with the Auditor General, and the AG will be in cabinet as well. So that is an issue that I will raise. The other part of your question, though you didn't ask it in that way, but I suspect that's what you intended, is there a process of sanction for contractors who fail to deliver? Presently, there isn't. Minister Vaz complains profusely in cabinet, not to take tales out of school, about contractors who keep turning up, but who have failed in the performance of their work. And I think from this Minister Vaz, I think, well, and that's the other issue. So the other issue is that they are endorsed. So it's not for us to say, well, you can't get the contract, because they have gone through the NCC process. But ultimately, based on the proliferation of these kinds of issues, the government should consider, and I'm saying should because we need to have a further discussion about a performance-based award system, that past performance should impact upon future success in contract selection. So I'm giving you that as a definitive undertaking, and I'm going to charge Minister Vaz, who has that passion, to pursue it.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Our next question from this side, then we go to that side. I see Danny standing beside Ms. Chisholm. Tona first.
I can go ahead. Good morning, Prime Minister. You're hearing me, right? I have two questions. First two questions. When will an energy minister be appointed? And my second question is the government divesting Petrojam?
Well, I'll be frank with you. It can't be too soon. It's a lot of work. But I've held on to the portfolio because of the delicate issues that are not just national issues or local issues, but because of the foreign policy implications that are surrounding that issue now. And as soon as that is resolved, then you ask about divestment, I will rapidly divest myself of it. But until we have gotten a breakthrough, because it really needs, because of the delicate nature of the negotiations now, it really needs that kind of direction to keep it on track. And I'm going to ask Minister Johnson-Smith, maybe at a later stage in the meeting, to give you an update. Sorry, just...
Yes, Tona, if you could.
Oh, if we're going to divest?
Yeah.
No, I can't answer that. Sorry, that's not the right answer. we're not at that stage yet. Remember, a couple of months ago, we have put together a commission, the Petrojam Review Commission, to advise the government as to what is the best approach to Petrojam. I can make some statements because I would certainly be one of the persons interviewed to come up with the recommendations. So statement one is the policy of the government is to have full utilization of national assets. So if Petrojam is not fully utilized in government ownership, then the policy of the government is that it should be put in a position that that be done. The policy of the government is one of wealth creation. So as far as possible, that we have these assets, we should seek to have the ownership shared with the public. Not just private sector entity, but we should seek to have our stock market expanded, to have democratic ownership, if you want to put it that way. The government, I can't say the government, I'll say I am increasingly of the view that shareholders are much better at holding enterprises to account than our voters. So if something can be operated on a commercial basis, you know, it should be operated on a commercial basis. The shareholders have a greater interest and pay greater attention. Sometimes when you have these public agencies, you know, you can have situations where people don't understand the enterprise itself, right? You have situations where, as we have now, there's a breakdown, and the cost of that breakdown comes to the public purse. So we need to look at the entire register of public agencies and say which should better be operated or which could better be operated by the private sector and place them there. In what enterprise do we have a strategic interest? Meaning that it is a public good or a global good, and we need to ensure that the public has access to it, even if not under market circumstances. And then we embrace those. Right now, the register of public agencies that we have don't all meet that criteria. There are some public agencies that government should not be in. And the quicker we get out of them, the better. So my short answer to you is that we are not there yet. We are putting in place a process because it's a huge national asset. We don't want to make the wrong decision, and we don't want to do it unilaterally. But from what I'm seeing, it is likely that that could be the case.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. On the other side, Ms. Chisholm.
Andrea Chisholm from TVJ. Prime Minister, two quick questions. First of all, will you ever consider Dr. Andrew Wheatley for a future position in your cabinet?
No. Okay. But on the issue of Dr. Wheatley, as I said, I paid keen attention to his public statements. My own determination, and I've met with Dr. Wheatley 3 times, is that I need to see that he understands where there have been shortcomings. And we are in that discussion, and he has explained where he has seen his own deficiencies and shortcomings. I've paid close attention to public opinion. And I don't think that the public is of a mood or a mind in that regard as yet. I'm always a believer in second chances and reforming, and I'm searching for the right word. Somebody help me with this word. It's redemption. I'm always a believer, I myself, and as a Christian, that's my principle.
So that's a yes?
No, I didn't give you an answer as yet. I'm taking the run up to the answer. And it's an answer that you have to give context to. So I've considered what is operating in his own mind by virtue of our meetings. I've considered public view, or the public, my assessment of public assessment of where the public is at this moment. But more importantly, there are still investigations and reports outstanding. So there could be no decision or consideration of Dr. Wheatley's return to the cabinet at this time. But if the reports that are left to come, the investigations in the future, what he does going forward, then, you know, if the assessment is such, then it should not be a difficulty. But as at this moment, there is still things to consider before we could reach to that point.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Henry, and then Mrs. Miller.
Yes, sir. I'm Balford Henry from the Observers. I just wanted to ask you, a few years ago, there was a breakdown in communications between the National Housing Trust and the ministry which was in charge of the trust. And that was over the outer mini issue. And what came out of that was that the person who represented the ministry and the board was not communicating with the ministry or the permanent secretary. And the ministry didn't know a lot of what was going on. So it is surprising that so many years after, the same issue is there again and nothing has been done to ensure that the person who's sitting on the board reports to the permanent secretary. And you need to give us some stronger indication as to what is going to be done this time. And one other thing, so the US $100 million that you are going to give back to the Ministry of Finance, is that for some specific project or
I'll ask the Minister of Finance to explain that part of it.
All right, thank you.
I'm glad you raised the question of the permanent secretary and the permanent secretary's representative, because we were discussing it this morning as to whether or not we had a plan as one of the things we should do, but we didn't decide on it. And I'm going to bring it to cabinet. We decide as to. It is, firstly, it is not always standard practice that the permanent secretaries have representatives, either ex officio or appointed by the minister, to the board. So some boards actually require that in their laws, and some ministers do it for greater accountability, but it is not always the case. Right? Bear in mind that the permanent secretary cannot sit on the boards, or should not sit on the boards over which they supervise, right? Because that would breach the accountability principle. So they have to send a representative whose role is to report. Now, Balfour, what we're talking about is a breakdown in the execution of the rules. So aside from what I'm saying about standardizing a permanent secretary's representative and the concern in on boards, and the concern in doing that is, do we have enough people? And how will that impact on the other jobs that the person who you assign would have to do? So that's a consideration. That's a resource constraint consideration that the cabinet has to look at. But outside of that, the breakdown is not because there isn't any rule. The breakdown is what people do. Sometimes people get overwhelmed, they forget. Sometimes people deliberately just don't do what they're supposed to do. And then we end up at this process. The way to address that is to ensure that when you are selecting boards, you select people who are competent and people who have high integrity and people who appreciate the principles of good governance. So what it comes down to is we have to strengthen the selection process for boards. We are never going to escape, and this is, you know, the public is saying you need to change this law and put it, yes, those are important, but the human factor, the quality of the people who you elect and select to administer public affairs cannot be overlooked. Cannot be overlooked. And so Minister Clark had announced a government policy which was developed, I believe, remind me, that would have been in 2010, thereabout, that policy was developed. The selection of boards, the selection of persons. Yes, the broad framework would have been developed long ago, developed in in thereabouts. And we are now implementing. Well, I'll ask you to come and explain where we are, but that will help in ensuring that we have a stronger, more integrous process in selecting persons to serve on boards. Minister Clark will explain. The 100 million.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Petrojam had made a decision to invest in a vacuum distillation unit, the VDU, that called for significant capital investment. That capital investment, or those funds, were not in PCJ, but had to be borrowed. At the time, the PCJ could not borrow in the private market because of the effect of the US sanctions on Venezuelan entities, PDVSA, and the Petrojam's involvement with PDVSA. So if Petrojam were to go ahead and invest in a vacuum distillation unit and needed to borrow funds to do so, they had to borrow from within the government. And therein, the proposal came for the government to lend 100 million US to PCJ, not to Petrojam, the parent company PCJ. And that loan was executed at, earlier this year, and the funds were transmitted to PCJ. Things have occurred since then, and that project has not started, and therefore the funds are not being used. PCJ is paying interest on the loan for a project that is not being implemented. And so, according to principles of the international best practices, public financial management, the Ministry of Finance will recall the loan from PCJ, and if in the future the VDU is a project that PCJ and Petrojam want to pursue, and at that time that they want to pursue it, PCJ, Petrojam cannot borrow in the private market, the government can look to lend again at that time.
Thank you, Minister. Prime Minister, Mrs. Miller.
Dion Jacks Miller, RJR TVJ. Mr. Prime Minister, given what the Auditor General described in terms of an almost complete lack of oversight and monitoring at Petrojam, are you minded to order audits of the other agencies and entities within that ministry? Two, to what extent do you think this was caused by the lack of the job descriptions for ministers that you promised the country, and are we ever going to see those? And three, I know the oil losses is hugely important, but there were so many issues of concern. Why restrict the forensic audit to that section alone?
Well, let me start with that question. As I said, I don't know what the Integrity Commission is investigating. And I wouldn't want to double up. I would suspect that they would be investigating those contracts that could lead to criminal investigations. And so that's why, just for the efficient use of the resources that we have, I know they are investigating, and I know they will be paying keen attention, especially to those issues that have been raised about contracts. But when you have this issue of the oil loss, some of which might be technical, you would need a technical expertise. You would need technical expertise who could do a forensic audit. So this is why I'm saying that we do the forensic audit on this massive oil loss. But on the others, I think we should allow the process, which is already engaged, to work.
Is that
the audits of other entities. Thank you for that, Dion. Actually, I did come with some announcements on other agencies. Within that energy portfolio, there is NESAL. And again, we have to look at the strategic value of NESAL. Does the conditions exist now that existed 30 years ago that would require a standalone agency, or could their function be delivered in a different modality? And so that consideration is ongoing, but we have taken the decision, which was almost foregone conclusion by virtue of the public sector reform, that NESOL will be one of the agencies that will be closed and its operations rolled into government with a specific modality as to how to continue to give the service without those huge overhead costs and the possibility of public administrative failures. So that is something that the public should be aware of. There are other agencies which I am presently reviewing, and then after I'm finished with that, I will make similar announcements to what I've just made. No, our ministers do get their job descriptions, not in the form that was committed, but they do get from me directives as to what should be done and what is necessary. But in fulfillment of the commitment, so that I'm not asked the question again, because I know you're writing it down to ask me in another 6 months or so, we will compile them and make them public. No, but the truth is, the ministers will tell you, they have been getting. We're going to be going into a retreat, CAPSEC, in January. And at that point, they will get another set of directives as to what it is that we want to do. And we'll make those public as well.
All right, sir.
Oh, no, it's January. What date in January would be the 17th of January, when we return from the Christmas break.
All right, thank you, Prime Minister. We'll have two more in the yellow at the back.
Good morning, Neil Wood, TBC Radio. Why can't we have government entities or agencies that can be run by Jamaicans and are viable? Why can't we have persons, is it that we don't have anybody who is capable or qualified to run them? And why is it that as soon as something is wrong, we are getting ready to divest them? That's the first part. The second part is, I watched the news and I noticed that you visited the lockups.
I'm sorry, with the lockup questions. As I said, I want to focus on Petrojam and on the report on the travels overseas.
Okay, so I'll leave the lockup question.
Thank
I'll
you,
go to, have you instituted any research on the effects of the roadworks on businesses in the corporate area, one, and also the effects of the ZOSOs and the SOEs?
Thank you, Ms. Wood.
Sorry. No. Jamaica has its fair share of competent persons who can run public bodies and private bodies. I don't think we have a shortage of competent people. What has happened over many decades is that the process of getting them involved has been such that some people shy away from it. I mean, even with this Petrojam issue, a lot of people are saying, why should I expose myself? You know, why should I put myself on the front line? So at this point, I want to thank the members of the board of Petrojam who have done so. And they keep telling me that, you know, it's not easy because there is not a discerning public opinion necessarily. Everybody's broad-brushed, and so you do put your reputation on the line, which is why we have decided to go through that process. And maybe now would be a good time, Dr. Clark, to explain. And just to be clear, just to be clear, I don't share the view that government must own everything and do everything. That's a dated view. Government must be progressive, but that doesn't mean that it must seek to own everything. For me, the role of government is first to create security, then to provide goods that only government can provide, public goods, security, health, education, social welfare, social safety net, housing in some regards. Private sector should be embraced, and in our case, we see the private sector as a big man. I don't see private sector like that. I see the effort of a small shopkeeper trying to meet the demands in their community by providing a service as the private sector. And we want more of those to facilitate them. They are the ones who will grow the economy. So government job is to support the private sector so the private sector grow the economy. When that happens, government revenues increase, and then we can pay public sector workers better. So we want efficient public sector workers working in support of the private sector so that the economy can grow. So I'm not rushing to divest anything. What I'm saying is that for the last 50 years, we have had institutions being created. The real rush is everything happens, we create an institution. Then institution has to have its own budget, its own board, its own governance. And sometimes, after a while, they're not relevant. The dynamics that created them in the first place change. But yet, we decide to keep them on the public budget. So it's not rocket science to look at the national budget and see the calls on the budget from institutions. Whether it is, you know what, let me not get into any problems by naming, but you can see them and say, couldn't this service be done otherwise? Do we need to pay this amount to get? So what we end up doing, because they're not giving a great deal of service, some of them, is that if you look at the budget and you say, how much goes to remuneration versus actual programs, you would be shocked. So the national budget is really going to remuneration, very little to programs and service delivery. We have to change that. We have to change that. So I'm not trying to dispossess people of their jobs and so forth, but inevitably the society is going to have to change, where government is smaller, more nimble, more agile, and the private sector is expanded and supported, and government plays a very strong role in regulation. So in addition to securing the prosperity through the economic development, the government also has to be progressive. So while we retreat on ownership, we have to increase on the provision and securing of the rights of the citizens. Because now is when you're going to need to have strong regulations over markets to make sure that people are not taken advantage of, that consumers have proper information so that they can make good decisions in the markets. And then corruption is not just seen as a private sector, a public sector issue. Now you have to transition to deal with corruption in the public sector, in the private sector. So it's a whole change of the society. And I don't think we should be afraid of it, because I detect that in your voice, that there's a fear of the change that has to happen. I think we should embrace it and just get with it very quickly. Because the truth is, the societies that have progressed over the last 20 years, this is what they have done.
Sir, members of the audience, it is now 11:48. We'll then take two final questions.
Take that picture.
And so Mr. Moore here, and then I did indicate that Mrs. Miller could have the last. Mr. Moore, if you could stand.
Just a quick response, Prime Minister. The Police Federation has been at odds.
The Minister of Finance is here.
Yeah, there have been calls for greater intervention into the wage negotiations. Are you prepared to intervene, and can a better offer be given at this time?
I'll let the Minister of Finance. You know, I've declared my position. I've declared my sympathy and my appreciation for the work that the police have done. Negotiations are delicate things, and I think that is as far as I can say at this point in the negotiation. Minister of Finance.
I believe Prime Minister wanted me to update on the selection, nomination. Yeah. So over time in society, we have been calling for better accountability, better governance processes, better methods of selecting and appointing people to board members. There was a period of consultation with society at large, with civil society, parliamentarians, people in the public sector, and over a period of time that culminated in a submission to the cabinet in June of 2018, Prime Minister Andrew Holness's cabinet, that was approved. And that drafted instructions have been issued to the Chief Parliamentary Council to revise the regulations around the selection, the nomination, selection, and appointment of board members. The Ministry of Finance has received the first draft of those revised regulations, and we're providing comments to the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Council, and hopefully the further drafts will be closer to what we want, and then it will be tabled in Parliament. Those procedures we spoke about earlier in June, but they will give regard to the competencies required for a particular public sector board. Do you need people with accounting skills or finance or energy or project management or engineering, as the case may be, and will ensure that the persons nominated have those skills before they can be approved. It will also allow for a wider database of persons who are available to serve on public boards, and so that the process is more transparent, more orderly, and we can be ensured that we choose from a diverse list of potential persons to serve on public boards. It will also mandate that a certain percentage of the board will consist of persons of either gender, so there'll be a minimum that either gender can be on a public board. It will limit the number of boards that one individual can chair, and so forth. Very advanced procedures for the nomination, selection, and appointment of board members that reflect what society has been calling on for some time. And it will identify the boards that operate in certain industries or with certain mandates where staggering of board appointments may be appropriate. So we're working assiduously on it. As I said, the Chief Parliamentary Council has turned over the first draft. We are going to give comments on that first draft and hope to get a second draft soon, and as we converge towards what will eventually be presented in Parliament. With respect to the question on the negotiation with the police, negotiations continue. I, for one, have spent a lot of time because the police are doing a tremendous job in the country, and we believe ought to be properly compensated within the constraints that the government has. We meet on Saturday for 6 or 7 hours, or on a Thursday from 11 until 7 in the evening, and have done so on many occasions. Most recently, at the request of the Federation, we dissolved into a working group at their request of technocrats who met, and that working group met twice. At the last meeting of that working group, that meeting didn't, the Federation probably were of the view that what was discussed in the meeting was not to their liking, and it ended prematurely. But it was a meeting that they were invited to of the working group, not a meeting with the minister. It was a meeting of the working group.
But you weren't deliberately absent?
No, I wasn't deliberately absent at all. No, I have been meeting with the Federation, as I said, and I can give you the dates.
I thought you were deliberately absent.
Not at all. November 22nd or 23rd or Thursday from 11 a.m. until 7 p.m., followed up on a Friday from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. And at that point, the Federation suggested, and I took on the suggestion, that we dissolve into a working group that consisted of the technocrats at the ministry from which, and they would meet with the Federation. That was their request. And that meeting was held on Monday, sometime in the first week of December. And that meeting was from about 3 o'clock to about 9 o'clock in the evening. And then the police were invited to a second working group meeting. And as I said, and it was a working group meeting without the minister. And that meeting did not go in the manner that the Federation expected or liked, and maybe for legitimate reasons, I don't know. And therein they went and made their statements. But it's a total mischaracterization to say that I was absent. It was never a meeting at which I was intended to be. The invitation came from in the context of the working group. Suffice to say that the discussions continue, and I met, with the Federation at 7:30 this morning before coming here, and I will be speaking to them again this afternoon. I'm making every effort, and have made every effort, to see that, we come to a successful conclusion.
Thank you, Minister. A final question then, please. 11:55.
But remember, we still have to go through the trip.
Yes.
Yes, and remember the Prime Minister was unavoidably late as well, Naomi. So we take that into account.
I went to sign the condolence.
Unavoidably late. Mr. Prime Minister, just following up on two other things you said. One, in terms of while you ponder the future of NESAL and the other agency, there can still have been slackness going on.
Yes. No.
Yes,
so my statement is, just to be clear, my statement is that I am presently doing that now, going through all of them, and where I see that there are issues that would rise to the level of a review, or maybe we have to call in the Integrity Commission or MOCA, that will be done. So I'm going through that now.
All right. The job descriptions, your response to that, it really sounded like you were talking about a to-do list for your ministers. And as you know, we've been asking you about this for the past 2 years. Is it that you just can't bother with this and you want to say to the public, look, it was a campaign promise, let's move on, we're done with that? And just
Absolutely not.
So, but what the public is expecting, I think, is not a to-do list that you give them every morning at Cabinet. It's an overall look at what the job of each minister should be, and that's what we've been waiting for now for the better part of 3.
Well, let me bring you in on something else that we have done, and so that I avoid the question again, because it looks as if there is something untoward. I will ensure that it is documented and put together in one accessible paper, the job description, the job letter. But Dion, we have as a cabinet, for example, now put in place a process of governance. I had said training, some ministers said they don't like that term, like we're putting them back to school. But for an hour before the start of cabinet, we invite persons who are experts, knowledgeable in the area of aspects of governance, and we go through it, all right? One of them that I found particularly relevant to the report was the whole business of how Petrojam procured, the use of emergency and direct procurement. One of the things that we got from that session, which I think profoundly resonated with the ministers, is that under our system that we have decided that this is what we're going to do, put up a procurement process. It means that ministers have to engage in advanced thinking and preparation. They cannot just happen upon a crisis. And indeed, I was very happy to see the same wording used in the Auditor General's report in talking about how Petrojam, and in fact what she said is that the board should now develop I'm just trying to go from memory, a system of advanced thinking about the problems before they become emergency, so that they will have a better handle on the issues, and that they would not incur things like overrun or get the worst price when, if they were planning from before, they could have gotten a better price and engaged in the competitive process. That has worked well, and I think most ministers know, I think all the ministers know, appreciate that in planning their yearly strategy, they have to now take into account the issues that could happen. They have to be doing advanced thinking rather than just happen upon situations. That I am going to reduce to writing now. Put it into the job letter, as you call it, or job description, and give it to our ministers. All right? So that it is in writing. But I assure you that they get that guidance.
Right. And just importantly, the return of the money to the Ministry of the Finance and pushing back the VDU. Now, given the importance of what we heard the VDU was going to do in terms of the future of Petrojam, isn't that something that's pretty much going to sound the death knell for the refinery?
No, I think before we spend $100 million, we should be very careful. Remember, you also have to consider the ownership. So Petrojam isn't owned totally by Jamaica. So spending $100 million in a situation where there are sanctions against our partner. You know, I don't want to go too much in detail, but you can extrapolate on the dangers that could exist with that. So we have to be very careful. I'll ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs to. Oh, you don't want to give an update on the negotiation so far, and I think we should say a few, just what we have been doing. Even the timeline, so that the public understands. I mean, you're suffering the same thing I'm suffering.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. To the unasked question, I will just advise, of course, as Prime Minister indicated earlier, that this is a process that has been ongoing for some time, because even before former Minister Wheatley and myself made the formal offer to repurchase in March of this year, there had in fact been several efforts made, several outreaches to the Venezuelan government as to their willingness to resell. And this is taken, of course, in the context that Venezuela's socio-political circumstances had become challenging from in 2016, and therefore it had been quite clear, signified by matters such as the inconsistent attendance of Venezuelan appointees, the implications of the circulation of the chairmanship of the board, matters which would...
Sorry, it's
the rotation of the chairmanship of the board, and issues like that, which are rooted in a different geopolitical time, as the Prime Minister indicated, and which had direct implications now for the operations of the business. Because of the very challenges which the Venezuelan government was experiencing and continues to this date, but in different circumstances. They had changes of ministers, they had changes of chairmanship and leadership of PDVSA, and all these matters caused a great challenge in moving forward the negotiations. Since there has been some stability in the discussion, since the formal offer has been made, there has still been a great deal of, let us say, there's not been alacrity. There is no deep desire on behalf of Venezuela or on PDVSA to sell. And this has made it quite challenging for the negotiation to proceed in a way that meets Jamaica's needs. We are making progress, or rather we have made some progress, but I think, as has been enunciated publicly on previous occasions, we also have to be realistic about the changing politics which do not reside within our control, and accordingly that we may have to recognize eventually a point where an amicable agreement is not feasible, and therefore explore other opportunities or other paths of ensuring that Jamaica's energy security and the strategic importance, as you have heard today, ownership is a precondition to making several decisions of commercial importance to the operations of the body. It therefore is not a decision that can continue to reside within the power of, within power which is not ours. So we will update in due course. The discussions do continue, correspondence continues. I continue to meet with not only the members of management of Petrojam, the review commission of the board, the review commission, as well as to be in touch with the board through the chairman to ensure that there are no matters, no shifting plate tectonics which may affect the negotiations of which I am not aware. As you're aware, the committee, the negotiating team is also myself supported by Chairman of the DBJ, PB Scott, Minister Favour Williams from Ministry of Finance, supported by the Attorney General's Chambers and the MSET and Petrojam team. Our work continues. Thank you.
It's a lot to digest, so I'll leave it right there. I wanted to give you a quick update, and I thank the press for staying with me, on our trip to Washington. And I start with Washington coming off this discussion because it was important that we visit Washington to ensure, one, that the important agencies of the American state can put a face to the name. And they know, so it's important to make that personal connection. And so we did a tour of Capitol Hill. We met with the National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, had extensive discussions about the region. I met with the OAS Secretary General, and I addressed the OAS, had extensive discussions about the region. I met with Senator Marco Rubio, who has responsibility in the Senate for this region. Well, the Western Hemisphere, larger than the region, but specifically as well for the region, as interests here. So we met with him. We met also with influential Senator Cruz. We met with the Democratic Black Caucus of Congress, influential members Maxine Waters and Sheila Jackson Lee, and other influential members who have all been very supportive of Jamaica, and I want to hear publicly say thanks. They have been critical and very helpful and supportive to Jamaica in our moments of deepest need, and we're indeed eternally grateful. We met with the Secretary of Housing, Ben Carson, and we met with the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. That is an absolutely important meeting for Jamaica. We signed a new framework agreement for cooperation in the area of energy, and I believe that that will significantly assist Jamaica in its energy security, both in the transition to LNG, but more importantly, in increasing our capacity for renewables. So that has to do with creating an environment in which there can be greater commercial participation and technology transfer for renewable energy. It was a very successful trip. I had a brief encounter with Vice President Pence and other influential persons in the administration. We went to G20, and I'll allow Minister Johnson Smith to give you an update on G20 and on CARICOM briefly. I know the voice is the same challenge, but I'm sure you will.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As you all know, that Jamaica has spent the year participating in G20 meetings, having been invited under the Argentine presidency for the first time. A Caribbean country was being invited to attend G20 to participate in all the meetings, and the Prime Minister was invited in that capacity, in his capacity of as chair of CARICOM, to represent CARICOM at this summit. Jamaica participated in meetings of agriculture, trade and investment, education and labor, as well as tourism. And there has been, I believe, incomparable visibility brought to Jamaica in and of ourselves as a nation on the international stage, as well as a representative body within CARICOM, or a representative member state of CARICOM. Interfacing at the level of the G20, the importance of it cannot be overstated when one considers that when we engage in bilateral relations, and a repeated refrain within the foreign ministry and within my colleagues of cabinet when they interact with their counterparts, there's often the request that when you are at the table in fora where we do not sit, could you raise the issue? Could you raise the issue of graduation and how it affects countries like Jamaica, which are upper middle income and unable to access certain concessions as a result of graduation based on GDP? Can you raise the issue of our high indebtedness and how this impacts on fiscal space when we're addressing matters of resilience and vulnerability? Can the OECD be persuaded to reconsider this issue? We now have on our side countries like Japan, France, the UK, Sweden, not necessarily in the G20, but having had related interactions, Norway, and others, who are deeply considering these issues, and as well as our multilateral partners like the IDB and the World Bank, who have taken this on, and the UN, and are now pressing it in their broader fora in order to make significant changes as to the financial architecture and the environment within which Jamaica has to operate. So it is an opportunity which we did not squander. At every stage, we ensured that Jamaica and CARICOM's positions were put forward, and the Prime Minister did so sitting at the table with his counterparts, heads of government and heads of state of the G20 in Argentina. They now know him by name. It makes a difference. It makes a difference in how we go forward. And therefore, I think we really have to congratulate the Prime Minister on how it is that he carried the mantle that has been given to him. I also want to thank my foreign ministry for the support that has been provided to the Prime Minister and to his team in the execution of his duties, and my cabinet colleagues who have represented solidly. Minister Shaw, I know when you attended the meetings as well, you made your usual deep impact, as did the Minister of Tourism, who used the opportunity to extend our movement and our airlift from South America and Latin America. Minister of Finance has, of course, attended meetings, as well as Minister Williams, and they again use the platform well to engage directly on matters through which we have only been able thus far to advocate. In respect of CARICOM, you will know that the Prime Minister is coming to the close of his chairmanship, and that it is a chairmanship which Jamaica entered at a time in which not only Jamaica, but Caribbean citizens, I would say, have been deeply considering the credibility and feasibility of CARICOM and the CSME. You know that the Prime Minister took a strategic view of issues, that rather than bend to the calls or the cries for blood and the bays for war, that we would in fact pursue diplomacy, and that we would in fact have a commission that would take an objective, academic, and informed view generally of Jamaica's position in respect of CARICOM, the CSME, and the region in respect of the North. That report catalyzed new thinking and new energy within the CARICOM member states. Not only did member states who were present, not only did we have representation and presence in Montego Bay in July of all the heads of CARICOM, which has not occurred for years, more than 5 years at least. A special meeting was decided or was determined to be necessary to review the CARICOM CARIFORUM Commission report, which came out of Jamaica, as well as the paper responding to same by Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonzalez, and to also review member heads' views on how it is we should go forward. There were consultation processes. COFAP met twice, which it had not done since, it had not met since 2013. The Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on the CSME, which also had not met in years, has also met since the meeting in Montego Bay. And coming out of this, the special meeting, which was hosted by Prime Minister Rowley in Port of Spain, had the commitment which the Jamaican Parliament sought. You will recall that both sides of the aisle debated the report and determined that around a resolution, we would take a position to the CARICOM meeting indicating that we would wish a commitment to the implementation of the CSME, and that if that commitment were not given within 5 years, we would reconsider our position, because at that point one would have to determine whether the changes you are making institutionally to address and fulfill the desires of Caribbean people to move capital, to move goods, skills, and labor, that if these were not being manifested, and in our case, in the benefit of the Jamaican people, that it would not make sense for us. The commitment has been given. There is much work to be done, but more countries signed on to the contingency protocol. There are issues which are being discussed. Our Attorney General chairs the Legal Affairs Committee, which has a significant amount of work to do in operationalizing these issues. But where the Prime Minister of Trinidad says no more protectionism, and I am able to turn to my counterpart, Ministers of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs and of Trade of Trinidad, to say we look forward to working together in COTED to see how we can make this a reality. It is a new day, and we have to congratulate the Prime Minister on his chairing of the meeting, on his ensuring that we reached conclusions, that there was reduced sort of self-indulgent talk that got the meeting nowhere. He kept a tight meeting, which ensured that all views were aired, but that we reached the commitment that was being sought. And I think Jamaica owes him warm congratulations for the strong showing that he has done on our behalf, and also in the interest of regional progress. I hope that is helpful.
Thank you, Minister. The effect of foreign affairs sometimes underplayed, underestimated, but it really has significant impact on the quality of life that we lead in the region. So, for example, coming out of our CARICOM foreign policy strategy, people who used to travel and were harassed, you rarely hear that so much these days, because we have executed a very, the foreign policy that we have, strategy that we have used is one of engagement, smart engagement, but leverage as well. We have managed to increase the number of skilled areas in which Jamaicans can travel. So now, once we have finalized it, Jamaicans will be able to travel as security guards. And that is a big demand in many regions where they are already at full employment. Jamaicans will also be able to travel as farm workers within CARICOM. So we've been traveling to United States and Canada. Now you probably could travel to Guyana or Suriname. And beauticians and barbers have always been there, but now we have specified that they can travel. That's beneficial. We have secured the commitment of CARICOM to pursue the common market. Very important for us, because right now it is almost in abeyance. Now we have a commitment, and that's so important. Minister talked about graduation. Graduation is the process by which international development assistance is given. Right now it's based on poverty, and therefore income is the critical measure. So Jamaica is considered a middle-income country, and therefore we may not qualify for certain types of international development assistance. But the truth is that the greatest threat coming towards countries like Jamaica now would be issues having to do with climate change, which exposes our vulnerability, both the vulnerability of our infrastructure, but our fiscal affairs. And so we have been championing, advocating a change in that system of how international development aid is given. You want to? Yeah, so, right, so we've been championing that, and Minister Clark can tell you a little bit more about some of the financial things behind it, but it is all for the benefit of the country. And we were given the distinct honor to work along with President Macron to raise awareness and raise the funds to get the international community to start contributing more towards resilience building. Minister Clark?
Sorry, this is not my usual practice. I haven't had a chance to even update the Prime Minister yet. But since he just mentioned it and following on the presentation from Minister Johnson-Smith, I couldn't sit with this news, Prime Minister. On Friday, I got a call from the Vice President of the World Bank. Jamaica has been constrained in what we can access from the World Bank for a long time. And in fact, we were looking prior to now on a period over the next couple of years where we'd have been maxed out on what we could access. When Prime Minister Holness came to office, we took the view that we're not going to pursue a confrontational strategy with the World Bank, but we're going to use diplomacy and putting our case forward. Well, Prime Minister, I got a call on Friday from the Vice President of the World Bank, Jorge Familiar, who said that the board had considered and they were coming to the determination that Jamaica will now have access to a further $200 million US, 190 to be precise. I'm just saying approximately 100 million US dollars of financing that we did not have access to before. And this comes a week after the G20 meetings.
So we've been taking care of business a yard and abroad. And we've been, I think, doing fairly well. The Petrojam matter, the public has my full assurance that we will do everything to ensure that there is restitution, that there is probity and accountability, that appropriate oversight will be done, and that the ministers will execute their responsibilities to the fullest. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, this is our final presser for the year. We want to thank all those who went live via traditional media and social media. And if we do not see each other again, may I wish you happy holidays. At the back, we'll have some refreshments. So please avail yourself, everyone. Have a good afternoon.